Before we open it up to the floor, I'd like each of the panelists to spend perhaps 5 to 8 minutes to share their initial thoughts on the documentary. If we could start with yourself, Olivia.
Okay, so I would just like to start by saying my sister was the paralegal, one of the paralegals for Lead Day on this case, but I had actually no idea about Operation Legacy until I read Ian Cobain's book, History Thieves. So I really, really recommend it. But what I found interesting about it was that what it demonstrates is a simultaneous policy of external obfuscation, but also internal miseducation. And we must think of the British Empire as primarily an economic arrangement. What it meant was the industrialization of Britain, because what it gave was, at the same time, huge amounts of free labor. It also gave, at the same time, captive markets to consume goods that were being produced in Britain. So what is that process going to mean about how Britain has to reconfigure its relationship with the rest of the world? The ability to obscure the truth about the past is one of the vestiges of British colonialism, as is the British Museum, as are other things, the Commonwealth, for example. You know, we can't forget that during, between 1757 and 1900, Britain's per capita GDP increased by 347%. And that figure is from Niall Ferguson, who actually believed that the British Empire was actually the most suitable distribution of resource for that time. So we have to look at this as primarily an economic arrangement, but the situation, as we saw with Operation Legacy, it wasn't just while the case pertaining to Kenya was an amazing precedent in one way. We're talking about £19.9 million that was allotted to over 5,000 claimants. So that added up to about £3,800 per claimant. So that's not I'm absolutely proud of personally my sister's contribution, role to some extent in it, but I'm also massively ecstatic that it happened. But there are limitations in terms of the direct kind of reparatory element to it. However, it is a precedent. It is a precedent, and moreover, it has completely revealed that it is a dialectic process. You know, at the first point when David Anderson had his interjection as a witness statement and drew on minutes from 1967 and said, look, there seems to be 1,500 files which are missing. The British government come out and say, yes, there's 1,500 files that are missing. Next, with more pushing, they come in and say, yes, there's 8,000 files that are missing. Yet with more pushing, they come out and say, yes, there's 20,000 files that are missing. But what has been seen when looking at Operation Legacy is, in terms of reporting at the time, the partition of India, you have the mentioning of a massive cloud of smoke going above Delhi because of the burning of files. You have mentioned at the time similar, almost simultaneous to that in Jerusalem, again the burning of documents causing, but there's other ways in which it reveals things. It reveals some things about, what are considered a progressive position in Britain. Part of it is from Malay, and that was an Attlee government that was doing that. At that time, some of the stuff that is obscured is what was being done at that time. Heads being chopped off and British soldiers posing with those heads on camera. These are the kind of things that it's obscuring, because the obscuring of that allows certain lies to be told about what Britain's role in the rest of the world was to people in this country. And my point is that while Britain is going to have to come to other countries that it has been dealing with superiority in the past on a more equal, and then as time develops, a far lesser footing, shall we say, economically, there's going to have to be some real awareness and cognizance demonstrated about what was the reality of this past.
Thank you.
when I look at Operational Legacy, I'm happy because of what you have done. It reflects exactly what the debate was all about in London, what we have missed. The last day when the veterans won, there was kind of a panic across the FCO, because now the issue was no longer about the Kenyan case. It was about the other colonies, because the other colonies, the people from other countries, they were just watching. So if this Kenyan case is successful, there was a big chunk of some countries willing to do the same. And that is what FCO was very keen to stop from happening. Where do we go from here? I believe, like you're arguing, Olivia, and many people feel this way. If there is a system that has something to do with the country, that is that country's part of heritage, then it's only fair to return all this history back to where it belongs. Give people the chance to know exactly what were the issues.
It is only the beginning. I was very much involved in this litigation claim here in London. Those elders you see there, we accompanied them to the Royal Court of Justice many, many times. I organized a seminar with them here upstairs in room 116, and we had a very, very fruitful time. And this was all in great part, not just because of our own wish to participate, but it was also upon the requests of the lawyers, the legal team. As you heard Dan Leader, one of the legal team members, saying our participation was critical. He, in his own words, asked us to make noise in London, and because making such kind of noise would help the case, and actually it did. So I'm very proud of that fact, that right here in the heart of the colonial institution, as has been said before, we were able to do something to help the tiny bit in this decolonization process. I insist that this whole thing is just the beginning. We are talking about 5,000 men and women who were compensated for these atrocities that perpetrated by the British government in the 1950s Kenya.
When I was growing up one day in Kenya, I was just a small child. Mau Mau was just an historical piece of information. I never knew one day I would grow up to meet the real Mau Mau coming to sue the British government in their own land, which was kind of ironical. But in terms of what comes quickly to my mind, I just remember one veteran because of age. We are inside the court, Royal Court of Justice, waiting for this, waiting for the veterans to come together for the court proceeding to start. But wonders of wonders, we realize one veteran is missing. And the court process is thrown into disarray because now we have to look for one veteran. And now everyone begins to imagine, where could he be? Did they give him a taxi from the hotel to the court? Or did someone accompany him? And in the end, after searching taxis and all, he's still missing. The court process is not starting. Someone decided, in the hotel they were staying, just speak to the porter. Someone knock on the door of his room. And wonders of wonders, he was fast asleep. So how nice. You sue the British government, but court process is starting, but you are fast asleep in your hotel. It just shows the irony of how all these people were and the injustice they had gone through. In fact, this man, when I spoke to him later, he said to me one time, he was going to give food to the Mau Mau, because that's the way it used to work. There are those who take food to them in the jungle. And when he was discovered by the police informant that time, he was arrested. He was hanged, hands straight, legs straight on a tree. And they used all these big pliers to crush his private parts. One of the things he used to tell me, even if you give me £1 million today, it means nothing. Because as a human being, I don't exist. I don't have a family of my own. The day I'm going to die, my history disappears. I interviewed women who would just tell me, they'll be taken by the riverside and told they're very dirty to jump in the water. After jumping in the water, they will come out, be lined up, told to put their legs apart, and they use bottles to, I don't want to say the rest. So it's just so, beyond belief what they really went through. But what comes out of that is a lot of truth which is never told. Because actually the first thing people don't know, it wasn't former Mau veterans. There were 11 of them. And they came from all corners of Kenya. And in that particular group of these veterans, it was so offensive to them when you say Mau Mau was a Central Province affair or a Kikuyu affair. They say exactly that's the way the colonial government wanted it to be seen as, because it becomes a small problem with one tribe causing trouble. And therefore the other tribes are okay with it. And a lot of books I've read, historical books, they tend to portray it the same way. And therefore, when I met with a veteran, that's something they always come across, which angers them. Say, no, this was a freedom-fighting movement across the whole country. They'll be happy it was portrayed as such.
A rebellion. It was not a rebellion of a bunch of militias who are poorly organized and so forth. During its height, the Mau Mau, so-called, because actually it was called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, had up to 40,000 fighting men and women in the slopes of Mount Kenya. That is not a small rebellion, in my view. 1 million people were detained. I think here we're talking about, from what I saw in the film, I think is underestimated. Because practically the entire Kikuyu and to a large extent Kamba population was actually in detention. It was not in those jails you saw there. Their own villages were prisons in themselves.
What I see also in what comes to my mind when I watch this fantastic documentary also is the efforts through which the government would go to kind of hide history. I've been to Kenya National Archives in Nairobi. There isn't much when it comes to history because, number one, a lot of documents, they lie in different parts in the UK. I've been to the National Archives as well. Oh yes, I've seen also the administrative maps at National Archives of how a town would be divided on who is living there. And the system was so quick to know who is living where in case they have to pick someone up. And when you just watch all this, it shows you a system of terror and a system that was really going the extra mile to do all they could. Number one, to dominate and to stay forever. If you have time, just watch this documentary known as End of Empire. And in this documentary, you see one guy is talking about, we can't go nowhere. This is our land. We were told it was our land in perpetuity, and therefore we can't go anywhere. So when you see him talking, saying that we have deepened the soil, with a lot of attitude, you're like, how do you deepen the soil of anywhere? So it just goes to show you the strength and the passion with which they were determined to hurt people and just to remain in control.
A charge against the British government for torture in the colonial era, which the British government did settle. It didn't make it into the press. It made it into the Cyprus Times and the Macedonia Times. And that was the only case they really identified as potentially coming forward as a result of this, because the people were still alive. They were teenagers at the time, and they did experience torture at the hands of the British colonial government, and they were found to be, the British government was found to be guilty. So they kind of weighed it up and they decided that, yeah. So unfortunately, in many cases, it hasn't set a precedent. And there are still many cases. I was in Northern Ireland Monday and Tuesday, and there are many, 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 many cases going on all the time in Northern Ireland, and they're looking very closely at the case in Cyprus. So that's a couple of things, and also just what you said about the economics of it all. I mean, the reason I got into this is because I really work in trade and labour, and it gives me a different perspective when I know not to trust any of the supposedly gracious trade arrangements that are being offered out by this country. And I see some of this work as very essential to people who are working in contemporary economic structures to understand how this has looked historically.